Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, I want to ask you a question that's been bothering me. We spend so much time talking about medieval kings, knights, crusades, and castles. But here's the thing, 90% of medieval people were peasants, farmers, laborers, people living in dirt floor huts with almost nothing. And yet, somehow, they survived. They survived winters that would kill most of us in a week. They survived famines that lasted years. They survived plagues, wars, violence, and a world that was actively trying to kill them every single day. So, that's what we're exploring tonight. Not the romanticized version of the Middle Ages. The actual, practical survival strategies that kept millions of people alive in one of history's harshest eras. Because here's what nobody tells you. Medieval peasants weren't just enduring. They had systems. They had knowledge passed down through generations. They had community networks and survival tactics that worked even when everything else failed. Some of this will shock you. Some will make you grateful for modern life. And some of it, honestly, might actually be useful if you ever find yourself without electricity, running water, or a grocery store. So before we begin, hit that like button if you're ready to learn real survival history. Subscribe if you want more content that goes beyond the surface. And comment telling me, what modern convenience do you think would be hardest to live without? Now let's go back. It's the 1300s. You're a peasant, and winter is coming. How do you survive? Chapter 1. Surviving winter, the coldest NIGHTS. Winter in medieval Europe wasn't just cold. It was deadly. No central heating. No insulation. No weather forecast. Just months of freezing temperatures that killed the weak, the old, and the unprepared. So how did peasants survive the coldest nights? The huddle strategy. First and most important, body heat. Peasant families didn't sleep in separate rooms. They slept together, all of them, in one space, sometimes in one bed. A medieval peasant home had one main room, maybe 15 feet by 15 feet. During winter, everyone, parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even the livestock, shared this space. Why livestock? Because a cow or a few goats generate significant body heat. Bringing them inside wasn't just about protecting the animals. It was about survival. A family sharing a room with their animals could keep the temperature several degrees warmer. The bed, if they had one, was a wooden platform filled with straw and covered with whatever fabric they could gather. The entire family slept together under layers of wool blankets, sheepskins, and cloaks. Body heat trapped under the covers created a microclimate warm enough to survive the night. If you didn't have enough blankets, and most didn't, you stuffed straw between layers of fabric, creating primitive insulation. You wore all your clothes to bed. You slept in your wool tunic, your cloak, your socks if you had them. The straw insulation method. peasant homes had dirt floors. In winter, they would cover these floors with a thick layer of straw or rushes, sometimes a foot deep. This served multiple purposes: insulation from the frozen ground, a softer surface than bare dirt, absorbing moisture and waste. The downside: the straw became a breeding ground for fleas, lice, and rats. But freezing to death was a more immediate concern than parasites. Walls were packed with mud, straw, and animal dung mixed together, wattle and daub construction. This wasn't just building material, it was insulation. Thick walls kept some cold out, though they were far from perfect. Fire management. Fire was life, but fire was also dangerous and expensive. Peasants had a central hearth, a fire pit in the middle of the room, with a hole in the roof for smoke to escape. Except the hole was small, so most of the smoke stayed inside, making everyone's eyes burn and lungs ache. But smoke was better than freezing. The fire never went completely out if they could help it. Banking the fire, covering coals with ash at night, kept embers alive until morning. Restarting a fire from scratch required flint, steel, and dry tinder, which wasn't always available. Fuel was the problem. Wood had to be gathered from common lands or forests, which meant hours of work. Coal was too expensive for most peasants, so they burned anything: wood scraps, dried animal dung, which burns surprisingly well, peat if they lived in marshy areas. Families rationed their fuel carefully. The fire was hottest during meal preparation and coldest at night when everyone slept huddled together. The window problem. Medieval peasant homes had tiny windows or none at all. Why? Because glass didn't exist for poor people. Windows were just holes in the wall, maybe covered with wooden shutters, which blocked light but kept out wind, oiled cloth or parchment, which let in some light but not much warmth, nothing, which meant you chose between light and warmth. In deep winter, people chose warmth. Windows were shuttered tight, making the interior dark but slightly warmer. Clothing layering. Medieval peasants understood layering long before modern outdoor gear existed. They wore a linen undertunic base layer, a wool tunic or dress insulation, a wool cloak or cape, outer layer wind protection, wool leg wrappings instead of pants, leather or wooden shoes stuffed with straw for insulation, a hood or coif to cover the head. Wool was essential. Even when wet, wool retains some insulating properties. Peasants kept their sheep not just for meat, but for wool, literal survival material. Community survival. When temperatures dropped dangerously low, communities came together. Multiple families might share one building, combining body heat and resources. Neighbors checked on each other, especially the elderly living alone. This wasn't charity. It was survival mathematics. A person freezing alone might die. A group huddled together might make it. The brutal truth: these strategies, people still died. The very young, the very old, the sick, they didn't always make it through winter. Hypothermia, frostbite, complications from cold-related illnesses. Medieval records show population dips every winter. The cold was a harvest of human life, but those who survived did so because they understood something we've forgotten. Survival isn't about comfort. It's about doing whatever it takes to see another sunrise. Chapter 2. Finding food when HARVSTS failed. Starvation was a constant threat in the Middle Ages. One bad harvest could mean famine. 2 bad harvests meant death. So how did peasants survive when food ran out? The grain storage system. Successful peasants stored grain from good harvests to survive bad ones. But storage was complicated. Rats and mice destroyed stores. Moisture caused rot and mold. Other people, desperate or criminals, stole food. Grain was stored in wooden chests elevated off the ground, clay pots sealed with wax, communal storage barns, guarded but still vulnerable. The wealthier peasants built small stone structures specifically for grain storage. But most couldn't afford this. Foraging, the real survival skill. When stored food ran out, peasants turned to the forests and fields. Medieval peasants had encyclopedic knowledge of wild edibles, edible plants, wild garlic, nettles high in nutrients, free everywhere, dandelion greens, sorrel, wild mushrooms, if you knew which were safe, acorns ground into flour after extensive processing to remove toxins, beech nuts, roots like wild carrots and turnips, protein sources, rabbits and hares, though hunting was often illegal, birds and eggs, fish from streams, if you were near water, snails and frogs, insects in desperate times. Foraging wasn't a hobby. It was a survival skill passed down through generations. Children learned from their parents which plants could save you and which could kill you. The poaching problem. Game animals, deer, boar, large fish belonged to the nobility. Hunting them was poaching, punishable by fines, imprisonment, mutilation, or death. But when you're starving, you take risks. Peasants set illegal snares for rabbits. They fished in restricted waters at night. They took what they needed to survive, knowing the consequences if caught. Some lords were lenient during famines, understanding that dead peasants couldn't work the land. Others enforced laws brutally, making examples of poachers. The bread extenders. When grain supplies dwindled, peasants stretched bread by adding ground acorns, pea flour, bean flour, sawdust, yes, really, ground bark, clay for bulk, not nutrition. This bread was barely edible, bitter, gritty, hard to digest. But it filled stomachs and provided some calories. Pottage, the survival stew, the staple meal of peasant life, was pottage, a stew made from whatever was available. Grain, barley, oats, rye, any vegetables, onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, peas, herbs for flavor, bones or scraps of meat, if available. Water, the same pot simmered for days, with new ingredients added as they became available. The bottom layers might be weeks old, creating a continuous stew that was constantly evolving. This wasn't meal planning. This was resource maximization. Animal survival equals human survival. Peasants who owned livestock faced impossible choices during famines. Slaughter the animal now for immediate food. Keep it alive for future milk, eggs, or breeding. Most chose to keep animals alive as long as possible, even when the family was starving. A cow provided milk. Chickens provided eggs. These ongoing food sources were worth more than one meal of meat. But when things got truly desperate, everything was slaughtered. The church as food bank, monasteries and churches sometimes provided food during famines. Monastery kitchens would make large pots of soup or distribute bread to the starving. This wasn't reliable, and it wasn't enough, but it saved some lives. Barter and trade. When money was scarce, which was always, peasants traded labor for food, handmade goods for grain, services for meals. A woman might do laundry for a neighbor in exchange for vegetables. A man might repair tools in exchange for bread. The starvation reality. Despite all these strategies, famine killed millions throughout the Middle Ages. The Great Famine of 1517 killed 25% of the European population. People ate grass. They ate leather. They ate things that should never be eaten. Contemporary accounts describe the unthinkable, but those who survived did so because they knew the land, knew the plants, knew how to stretch resources impossibly thin, and knew that survival sometimes meant making choices no one should have to make. Chapter 3. Staying Warm, Medieval Heating Hacks. We've talked about surviving the coldest nights, but what about the rest of winter? How did peasants stay warm during the day without freezing to death? The layering philosophy. Medieval peasants lived in their clothes. Literally, they wore the same layers day and night, only removing them for the rare occasion they could wash. Wool was everything. Wool underwear, if they could afford it. Wool tunic or dress. Wool stockings or leg wraps. Wool cloak. Wool hood. Why wool? Because it's one of the few materials that insulates even when wet. In a damp, cold climate like medieval Europe, this was life-saving. Linen undergarments served a purpose. They absorbed body oils and sweat, protecting the outer wool layers from becoming too filthy too quickly. When possible, you washed the linen, easier and faster than wool, while keeping the wool relatively clean. Fat as insulation. In summer, peasants worked hard and stayed lean. But in autumn, they tried to gain weight. Body fat is insulation. Going into winter with extra pounds could mean the difference between survival and hypothermia. Peasants understood this instinctively. Harvest season meant eating as much as possible, while food was available. The shared warmth economy. Medieval peasants didn't isolate. They gathered multiple families in one building, community spaces like the Lord's Hall for special occasions, churches which were warmer than homes, work buildings where heat was generated, bakeries, smithies. People worked together in enclosed spaces, using combined body heat to stay warm. Tasks that could be done indoors were saved for winter. Movement and work, staying active, generated body heat. Peasants worked throughout winter, repairing tools, spinning wool, weaving, wood carving, any indoor task that kept hands and bodies moving. Sitting still meant getting cold. Movement meant survival. Hot stones and heated bricks. A clever medieval hack. Heat stones or bricks in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and use them as portable heat sources. Place them in your bed before sleeping to warm the blankets. Carry them in your pockets or under your cloak during the day. Use them to warm specific body parts, feet, hands. This required fuel to heat the stones and enough stones to make it worthwhile. So it wasn't available to the poorest. But many peasants used this technique, sealing every gap. In autumn, peasants prepared their homes for winter, stuffing gaps in walls with moss, mud, or cloth, covering windows with whatever material they had, creating a barrier of straw or branches around the outside of the building, building up the straw layer on floors. Every tiny gap that let in cold air was a threat. Alcohol as warmth. Small beer and ale weren't just safer than water. They provided calories and created a warming sensation. Peasants drank weak alcoholic beverages throughout the day, providing both hydration and a slight warming effect. The communal bed. We mentioned this earlier, but it's worth emphasizing. The medieval peasant bed was a survival tool. A large wooden platform held the entire family plus, sometimes a neighbor, guest, or hired worker. Everyone piled together under layers of blankets, creating a warm microclimate. Privacy wasn't a concept. Survival was. Church attendance. Churches were stone buildings that retained heat better than peasant huts. Sunday Mass and religious feast days gave peasants a few hours in a slightly warmer building. Some elderly or sick people spent entire days in churches during the worst winter weather, claiming to be praying, but really just surviving. Fire safety versus warmth. The ever-present tension. Fire kept you warm, but could kill you even faster than cold. Peasant homes burned down regularly. Thatched roofs were incredibly flammable. Wooden structures dried by summer sun became tinder in winter. Families kept water nearby, watched fires constantly, and banked them carefully at night. But accidents happened. Burning to death or freezing to death, medieval life offered cheerful choices. The psychological element. Medieval peasants also survived through sheer mental toughness. They knew winter would end. They'd survived before. They would survive again. This generational knowledge, the certainty that spring would come, helped people endure the seemingly unendurable. Chapter 4: Water and Hygiene Without Dying. Clean water and basic hygiene are life or death issues. Medieval peasants lived in a world where water could kill you, and bathing was considered dangerous. So how did they stay alive? The water problem. Medieval water sources were frequently contaminated. Wells could be polluted by nearby latrines. Rivers carried waste from upstream villages. Standing water bred disease. No one understood bacteria or germs. Drinking water directly was risky. Peasants developed workarounds. The ale solution. Everyone, men, women, children drank weak ale, small beer, instead of water. Why? The brewing process required boiling water, which killed pathogens, even though no one knew why. The alcohol content, usually 1-3%, provided additional antibacterial properties. Every household brewed their own ale. It was a survival necessity, not a luxury. Women typically handled brewing, making it a crucial survival skill passed from mothers to daughters. Water collection, rainwater collection, was safer than well or river water. Barrels placed to catch roof runoff, used for washing clothes and bodies, sometimes for drinking if boiled. Wells were communal resources, carefully maintained and guarded. Villages depended on their wells, and poisoning a well was one of the gravest crimes. Hygiene realities. Medieval peasants didn't bathe regularly by modern standards, but they weren't completely filthy either. Hand and face washing. Most people washed hands and face daily with cold water. Hand washing before meals was common, though the water itself wasn't always clean. Full body washing, rare but not unheard of. Maybe once a month in summer, even less in winter. Methods included wiping down with a wet cloth, quick wash in a stream or river in summer, occasionally heating water for a brief bath in a wooden tub. The bathing debate. Medieval medicine believed bathing opened your pores and let disease in. Hot baths were considered medically dangerous, potentially allowing evil humors to enter the body. This belief was reinforced by reality. People who bathed in contaminated water or weakened themselves by bathing in cold weather did get sick, so limited bathing became the norm, justified by both practical experience and medical theory. Laundry, washing clothes, was an enormous task. Haul water from the well, heat it over a fire, requiring fuel. Scrub fabric with lye soap, caustic and harsh. Rinse more water hauling. Dry, challenging in wet climates. Most peasants owned 1 or 2 outfits. They might wash them monthly if they could afford the time and resources. More often, they just aired clothes out and spot-cleaned stains. Undergarments were washed more frequently than parasites. Everyone had lice. Everyone. It wasn't a question of if, but how many. Management strategies. Picking lice out of each other's hair, social bonding activity. Cutting hair short. Wearing head coverings to contain the problem. Herbs like lavender and rosemary to repel insects. Regular checking and removal. Acceptance was key. You couldn't eliminate parasites, so you managed them. Toilet facilities. Peasant homes had no toilets. Options included chamber pots emptied into compost heaps or fields, outdoor latrines, a hole in the ground behind the house, the woods if nearby, ditches along roads. Human waste was used as fertilizer. Medieval peasants understood the agricultural value of manure, even if they didn't understand the disease risks. Menstruation. Women used rags, which they washed and reused. These menstrual rags were a closely guarded necessity, washed separately and privately. Some women used wool padding. Wealthier women might have multiple sets of rags. Poor women made do with whatever cloth they had. Teeth cleaning. Teeth were cleaned by chewing on twigs, which actually works reasonably well. Rinsing with water or ale. Rubbing teeth with cloth. Using powders made from crushed herbs, salt, or chalk. Toothbrushes didn't exist, but people tried to maintain oral hygiene. Still, tooth decay was common, and dental problems often led to serious infections. The survival mindset. Medieval peasants accepted that perfect cleanliness was impossible. They focused on keeping water sources clean enough to use, washing hands to prevent the spread of visible dirt, managing parasites rather than eliminating them, maintaining basic hygiene that didn't require resources they didn't have. They survived not through modern sanitation, but through immune systems built from lifetime exposure and practices that worked even if they didn't understand why. Chapter 5. Dealing with sickness, no DOCTORS. Getting sick in the Middle Ages was terrifying. No antibiotics, no hospitals, no real understanding of disease, just hope, home remedies, and prayer. So how did peasants survive illness? The herbal medicine cabinet. Medieval peasants had extensive knowledge of medicinal plants passed down through generations. Every village had women, and sometimes men, known for healing skills, common remedies that actually worked. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, basically aspirin, for pain and fever. Garlic antibacterial properties for infections. Honey antibacterial for wounds and coughs. Chamomile for digestive issues and sleep. Yarrow to stop bleeding. Comfrey for broken bones. It does promote bone healing. Feverfew for headaches and fever. St. John's wort for mood disorders and wounds. Not everything worked, but enough remedies were effective that herbal medicine kept people alive. The village healer. Every community had someone, usually an older woman known for healing knowledge. she wasn't a doctor. She was a combination of herbalist, midwife, practical nurse, sometimes accused witch. These women set broken bones, delivered bobbies, created poultices and salves, gave advice based on generations of experience, were essential community members. Home remedies. When someone got sick, families tried. For fever, cool water compresses, willow bark tea. Rest. For wounds, clean with alcohol, ale, or wine. Apply honey. Bandage with clean cloth. Monitor for infection. For digestive problems, fasting, chamomile or mint tea. Light broth. For coughs, honey and herbs. Steam from hot water with herbs. Rest and warmth. For infections, garlic eaten or applied topically. Drawing salves to pull out pus. Lancing boils, dangerous, but sometimes necessary. Religious healing. When medicine failed, peasants turned to religion. Prayer, pilgrimages to healing shrines. Relics believed to have healing power. Holy water, blessings from priests. This wasn't just superstition. The placebo effect is real, and hope can aid recovery. Plus, some religious practices, confession, absolution, community support, provided genuine mental health benefits. Quarantine practices. Medieval people didn't understand germ theory, but they observed that sickness spread. During plague outbreaks, communities implemented crude quarantine, isolating the sick, avoiding travel to infected areas, burning possessions of the dead, closing town gates. These measures worked to some degree, even though no one understood why. Bloodletting and dangerous practices. Some medieval medical practices were harmful. Bloodletting, cutting people to drain bad blood, actually weakened patients. Purging with strong laxatives depleted nutrients and fluids. Cauterization, burning wounds, caused more damage. Trepanation, drilling holes in skulls for headaches. Peasants generally couldn't afford barber surgeons who performed these procedures. In this case, poverty might have saved lives. Preventive measures. Smart peasants tried to avoid getting sick. Eating garlic regularly. Immune support. Avoiding sick people when possible. Keeping wounds clean. Maintaining strength through adequate food when available. Wearing protective amulets. Psychological comfort. Childbirth survival. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life. No sterilization, no surgical intervention, limited ability to handle complications, survival strategies, experienced midwife assistance, multiple women attending to provide support, herbs to manage pain and encourage labor, prayer, hope. Women who survived multiple childbirths developed some immunity to infections. But every pregnancy was a gamble. The tough reality: most illnesses resolved on their own or killed the patient. Medieval peasants had surprisingly strong immune systems from constant exposure to pathogens. But when serious illness struck. Elderly often didn't recover. Children had high mortality rates. Young adults had the best survival chances. Everyone understood death was close. Community care. When someone fell seriously ill, neighbors helped, bringing food, caring for children, doing farm work, sitting with the sick, preparing for death if necessary. This wasn't organized healthcare. It was community survival. Today you help your neighbor. Tomorrow they might help you. The survival truth. Medieval peasants survived illness through strong immune systems built from lifelong exposure, effective herbal remedies, community support, sheer toughness, luck. Many didn't survive, but those who did carried forward the knowledge of what worked, creating a practical medical tradition that kept communities alive despite impossible odds. Chapter 6. Protection. Violence was everywhere. The Middle Ages were violent. Bandits, wars, feuds, casual cruelty, danger was constant. Peasants had no police force, no rights, and no real protection. So how did they stay alive? The community defense system. Isolated peasants were victims. Communities survived together. The village network. Everyone knew everyone. Strangers were immediately noticed and questioned. Strange activity was reported. Community members looked out for each other. This wasn't neighborly kindness. It was survival strategy. The hue and cry. When a crime occurred, victims raised the hue and cry, a loud shout for help. All men within earshot were legally obligated to respond and help pursue criminals. This community policing system wasn't perfect, but it was the only defense most peasants had. Physical defense. Peasants couldn't own swords or armor, but they could defend themselves with agricultural tools, axes, scythes, hammers, clubs and staffs, knives, bows for hunting, legally dubious but common, numbers, safety in groups. Most peasants learned basic combat from working with heavy tools. A man who could swing a plow could swing a weapon, dealing with bandits. Bandits and outlaws preyed on travelers and isolated farms. Defense strategies. Travel in groups. Avoid known dangerous areas. Travel during daylight. Carry weapons. Fight back if necessary. Hand over goods. If outmatched, possessions could be replaced. Lives couldn't. Protection from lords. Ironically, peasants sometimes needed protection from their own lords. Unfair taxation. Arbitrary punishment. Abuse of power. Defense strategies. Appeal to higher nobles. Church intervention. Priests could sometimes protect peasants. Collective bargaining. Entire villages refusing to work. Passive resistance, working slowly. Misunderstanding orders. Flight running away to another manor or a town. Wartime survival. When armies passed through, peasants faced looting, rape, murder, forced conscription, crop destruction, survival strategies, hide valuables bury grain, hide livestock in forests, hide people, especially women and girls, evacuate to fortified churches or castles, if allowed, cooperate enough to stay alive, but hide what you could, sometimes fleeing entirely. The church as sanctuary. Churches offered legal sanctuary. A criminal could claim sanctuary in a church and gain temporary protection from secular punishment. This system occasionally protected peasants from vengeful lords or angry mobs. Women's protection. Women faced specific dangers: sexual violence, harassment, vulnerability when traveling alone. Protection strategies: travel with male relatives, stay in groups, avoid dangerous areas, learn to fight back. Community enforcement: men who harmed women faced social and sometimes violent consequences. Children's protection: children were vulnerable to kidnapping, abuse, being sold into service, being killed during conflicts. Families protected children by never letting them wander alone, teaching them to hide when danger approached. Community supervision: everyone watched all children. Conflict resolution: medieval peasants developed systems to resolve disputes before they became violent. Village courts, manorial courts, settled disputes. Church mediation, elder councils, compensation systems, pay for damages rather than fight. Not all conflicts could be resolved peacefully, but communities tried to avoid destructive feuds. The castle manor system. In theory, lords protected peasants in exchange for labor and goods. In practice, this protection was minimal for day-to-day threats, somewhat effective against large-scale threats, invading armies, often used as leverage to extract more from peasants. But during serious threats, peasants could sometimes shelter in the lord's fortified manor or castle. The brutal reality: despite all these strategies, violence killed many. Bandit attacks, wars destroying entire villages, lords executing peasants for minor offenses, feuds escalating to murder, casual cruelty going unpunished. Peasants survived by being alert, staying in groups, avoiding attention, and being ready to fight or flee at any moment. The Middle Ages were not safe. Survival meant constant vigilance. Chapter 7: Childbirth and Children, Survival Rates. Having children in the Middle Ages was necessary for family survival, but incredibly dangerous for both mother and child. Let's talk about how anyone survived childhood and how families coped with staggering loss. Childbirth, the most dangerous day. For women, childbirth was the leading cause of death. Statistics were brutal. 1–2% of births resulted in maternal death. Multiple pregnancies meant cumulative risk. Surviving 5–10 childbirths made you exceptionally lucky. The midwife system. No doctors attended peasant births. Instead, midwives, experienced women in the community, provided care, assisted with labor, knew techniques to turn breech bobbies, understood herbal pain management, could handle some complications, couldn't perform surgery or handle serious issues. Other women from the community attended births, providing physical support, emotional comfort, practical help, prayers, childbirth survival strategies, preparation. Women worked until labor began, building strength. Midwives provided herbal preparations to ease labor, prayer and religious amulets for protection, birthing stools or positions that used gravity. Thanks for listening.